My name is Noah, and until last year, my life felt like it had been carefully written in advance. Everything followed a familiar pattern. I had a stable job, a peaceful routine, and a wife who once looked at me as though I was the most important person in her world. At some point, though, that warmth quietly disappeared. The change was so gradual that I never realized it was happening. I had become so comfortable with routine that I failed to notice the love slowly slipping away. People rarely become distant overnight. They grow cold little by little, like a cup of coffee left sitting on the kitchen counter. At first, it stays warm, then it turns lukewarm, and eventually it becomes completely forgotten. My wife was never the type to express cruelty through shouting or angry arguments. She never slammed doors, threw things, or stormed out of the house. Her way of hurting me was much quieter. It came through silence, indifference, and small actions that slowly made me feel invisible. It appeared in conversations that never happened, in excuses about always being tired, and in countless little moments where I became an afterthought. Every day, another piece of our relationship quietly disappeared. I kept telling myself that marriage naturally changed with time, that every couple went through difficult seasons. Looking back now, I realize I was only making excuses because I was afraid to admit the truth. Everything finally fell apart on my birthday. Or maybe I should say it was the day she chose to pretend my birthday didn't exist. She had always remembered it before. In fact, she used to joke that she could never forget because my birthday was the same date as her childhood dog's birthday. Every year she smiled when she said it, and somehow that silly joke became one of our traditions. But that morning arrived differently. There was no smile waiting for me, no gentle kiss before work, no whispered happy birthday, not even a simple acknowledgement as we crossed paths in the hallway. She walked past me with her eyes fixed on her phone. "Morning," I said, hoping she would finally look up. "Yeah, I'm late," she muttered before rushing out the front door without another word. I stood alone in the kitchen, my coffee frozen halfway to my lips. The silence she left behind felt heavier than anything she could have said. At first I wondered if she had simply forgotten, but deep inside I already knew better. Later that afternoon my phone rang. It was my best friend, Mason. "Happy birthday, man," he said with his usual enthusiasm. The kindness in his voice almost broke me. "You doing anything tonight?" he asked. "Not sure yet," I answered, forcing a smile he couldn't even see through the phone. I tried to sound normal, pretending everything was perfectly fine. When evening came, she returned home looking strangely cheerful. She dropped her bag on the kitchen counter and immediately started talking about how exhausting her day had been and how hungry she felt. I waited. I kept expecting her to suddenly stop talking, look at me, and realize what day it was. I waited for the apology that never came. Instead, she heated leftover food, scrolled endlessly through her phone, and quietly ate dinner without meeting my eyes even once. That was the exact moment something changed inside me. It wasn't anger. It wasn't heartbreak. It was clarity. She hadn't forgotten my birthday. She had simply decided that it no longer mattered. That realization hurt far more than if she had admitted she forgot. Later that night, after she had fallen asleep peacefully, I remained alone at the kitchen table. The house was completely silent except for the ticking clock on the wall. I grabbed a notebook and started writing. The first list contained everything that still belonged to me, things that genuinely made me feel alive, things that no one could take away. Then I made another list. This one was different. I wrote down everything I wouldn't miss if it disappeared tomorrow. When I finished, I stared at the pages for several minutes. The second list was much longer than the first, and somehow seeing that truth written in my own handwriting changed everything. The following morning, I left the house before she even opened her eyes. I drove without any destination in mind until I reached a quiet lake on the edge of town. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the first light of sunrise like polished glass. I stood there in silence, staring at my reflection. The man looking back at me seemed unfamiliar, as if he had spent years living someone else's life instead of his own. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider a thought I had been avoiding for months. What if I simply didn't stay? Instead of fear, the idea filled me with an unexpected sense of peace. When I returned home, the house was empty. Her car was gone, and the cardigan she always left hanging by the front door had disappeared as well. The empty rooms felt strangely comforting. Without her presence, every decision suddenly became clear. I began selling everything, not out of anger or impulse, but with careful intention. My tools went first, then the couch, the television, and the dining table we barely used anymore. Piece by piece, I removed every object connected to the life where I had slowly become invisible. By evening, half the house was empty. For the first time in years, I felt lighter than I could remember. Over the next few days, I continued. The artwork came down from the walls. Furniture disappeared one item at a time. Books that had collected dust for years found new owners. Every object carried memories of a version of my life I no longer wanted to keep. I didn't feel guilty. I felt free. Once the house was nearly empty, I sat alone on the living room floor with nothing but a notebook beside me. That was when another idea entered my mind. If I was rebuilding my life, maybe I should rebuild my identity too. I began writing names across the page: Liam, Theo, Jasper, Silas, Adrian. Each one represented another possibility, another chance to become someone untouched by years of neglect. But one name refused to leave my thoughts: Silas Gray. It wasn't flashy or dramatic. It was simple, steady, and strong. More importantly, it felt like protection. It felt like armor. The next morning, I walked into the DMV and began the long, exhausting process of legally changing my name. Every document I signed reminded me how deeply identity is woven into every part of life, yet every signature also felt like cutting another thread that had tied me to a life where I no longer belonged. By the end of the week, everything had changed: new driver's license, new truck registration, new email address, new accounts. Silas Gray officially existed. Noah hadn't died. He had simply chosen to walk away. When my friends heard about it, most of them couldn't believe what I'd done. Mason called almost immediately. "You actually went through with it?" he asked in complete disbelief. "Yeah," I answered calmly. "Everything connected to the version of me that felt invisible is gone." He didn't know what to say. Very few people ever do. Unless you've experienced the slow, silent death of a relationship that once felt full of love, it's almost impossible to understand. Not long afterward, I rented a small apartment downtown. There wasn't much inside, just a bed, a desk, a lamp, a few clothes, nothing expensive, nothing unnecessary. Yet it felt more like home than the house I'd left behind. The silence no longer felt lonely. It felt peaceful because it was finally my choice. A few weeks later, letters began arriving: a birthday card addressed to Noah, packages I never opened. Then one afternoon, I received a message from an unfamiliar number. "Silas, is this really you?" I stared at the screen for several moments before locking my phone. I never replied. I didn't need to. Whatever confusion, regret, or apology she carried belonged to a chapter of my life that had already ended. Months passed. Slowly, I rediscovered happiness in the smallest moments: a perfectly brewed cup of coffee, quiet mornings beside the window, the comfort of knowing I no longer needed anyone else's approval to feel valuable. The loneliness I once feared gradually transformed into peaceful solitude, and that solitude became strength. One afternoon, while walking through downtown, I saw her. Her hair was carelessly tied back, and her eyes looked just as distant as I remembered. She walked right past me. She didn't recognize me. My heart remained steady. My stomach didn't tighten. I didn't feel anger, sadness, or regret. Silas Gray simply kept walking. For the first time in years, I felt completely at peace. Sometimes I still think about forgotten birthdays and all the quiet moments when my love disappeared into empty walls that never echoed it back. But those memories no longer hurt. They remind me how far I've come. I smile now, not because I won and not because she lost, but because I finally became whole again. I became Silas Gray. More importantly, I finally chose myself. That was the day I stopped being invisible, the day I reclaimed every piece of myself that I had given away so freely. There was no dramatic confrontation, no screaming, no revenge, only quiet freedom, a fresh beginning, a new identity, and a man who finally learned that his own worth never depended on someone else's ability to see it.